everyone. I'm Chris Lesniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast. We have an exciting debate on today's episode. We often hear various ideas and opinions about having students memorize facts and formulas. From multiplication facts to calculus formulas and everywhere in between, memorization is often a part of math class.
But should it be? Or what should and shouldn't be memorized? So we thought that we would have a great debate topic, as in, should we stop making students memorize? Today, we have two teams of two debating this resolution.
And here debating for the resolution, the pro side, that we should stop making students memorize, we have two wonderful educators. First up is veteran teacher of 22 years, a blogger who shares ideas on improving math education, and now the author of Make Math Not Suck, Dr. Mandi Tolen. Hi, Mandi.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Absolutely. I am in Northern Missouri, and I teach high school math, and I also teach some college level statistics classes.
Excellent. And arguing along with her on her side is the founder of Math Plus Academy and a founding member of the Global Math Project, and a man on a mission to make math irresistible to kids, Dr. Raj Shah. Hi, Raj. Oh, you're muted. Hi, Raj.
Classic. Hello. Thanks for having me here. I am in Columbus, Ohio, and as you said, founder of Math Plus Academy for 14 years, and happy just to be a part of the Global Math Project.
And while I'm talking to you both, I want to ask you each the question we ask all of our guests. When did math first become controversial to you? And I'll start with you, Mandi.
Perfect. I actually kind of have a two-part answer to this question. When I was in my math education program to become a teacher, I actually had a teacher in my Calc 3 class who looked at me and said that he didn't think women had the mind for mathematics and that I shouldn't be in the class. I passed, so it's fine. And then when I got into my first teaching role, I realized that I didn't want my students spending all the time that they were spending on homework, and I wanted to do things a little bit different than I had been taught. And I got a lot of pushback from admin and from parents. And I realized then that people have a very set idea of what math should be, and my idea wasn't the same as theirs.
That's a very powerful story. Thank you for sharing that. And Raj?
Wow, good question. I think for me, it would be the when Common Core started coming around, and I work with a lot of parents through Math Plus, and parents come to me and say, why is it different? Why are they doing everything different now? It's so confusing. My kid doesn't understand. And I took a moment to explain to this mom, like, why we would teach partial products instead of the standard algorithm, at least partial products first or earlier. And she goes, oh, that actually makes sense. And if I'm being honest, my son actually understands this better anyway. And I was like, yeah, exactly. So that to me was kind of the moment where I was like, I got thrown into the math wars, so to speak. And from then on, I knew which side I was on, and that's kind of what I've been doing since.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you both.
So now we have a team of two arguing against the resolution. And first up is a veteran math teacher of over 20 years of experience, co-author of the book Brain-Based Learning, and an international speaker who bridges her knowledge of how the brain best learns with the experience of teaching math, Liesl McConchie. Hi, Liesl.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having us on. I'm really excited about this. So I'm Liesl. I'm coming from sunny San Diego here today. This is where I come from. And my background is in teaching, spent many years teaching, and then spent some time overseas studying the Scandinavian school system. Spent some years over there, started a school over there, which is still up and running and doing well. And now back here in California, I support that school and then many other schools around the world who are working to align their pedagogy with how the brain actually learns. So that's what I do. I write and I consult with schools all over the world.
Wow, thank you. And arguing along with her is an experienced educator, blogger, author, speaker, professional developer, student, mathematician, and author of Necessary Conditions, Geoff Krall. Hi, Geoff.
Howdy, all. I'm coming from Fort Collins, Colorado. I am currently a PhD math education student, as well as a lecturer at the University of Wyoming. So I spend my time learning how to better teach my courses. I teach elementary math for elementary teachers, as well as a math for middle school teachers graduate level course at the university. Also in my free time, which I have so much of, I also consult with schools. I do some writing, and then I try to set aside time for my actual studies, which will hopefully be wrapping up in a couple of years.
Awesome. And now the question we ask all of our guests: when did math first become controversial to you? We're going to start with you, Liesl.
Okay. So the first thought that came to mind about when math became controversial was my first year teaching. So we're going back in time over 20 years ago. And first year teaching, one of the classes I was teaching was a high school geometry class. And I just remember hearing from so many other teachers and my department about how awful it is to teach geometry proofs. And I had my own, traumas stored in my brain about learning proofs in my own geometry class. And so I had a lot of my own anxieties around that, but I was really determined to find a way to bring joy to geometry proofs and some new ways of approaching it. And it was at a time when the original CSI series were a really big deal at the time. And so we just turned our classroom for a few weeks into a CSI crime scene where, some ray was bisecting some angle and, parallel lines or, all these things were happening, these, pictures from the scene of the crime and what's the evidence and what do we already know? And people were shouting out in the middle of the classroom, I object, it is not, this theorem, it is this one over here that proves that it is guilty of bisecting the angle. And it just was, for me, an experience that my first experience of recognizing that the narratives we have around math pedagogy are not always true. And that set me on a path of really just being more reflective and analyzing the narratives we have around math pedagogy and wanting to bust some of those and really understand how we can make math come to life for our students.
Wow, thank you. The CSI thing sounds familiar, maybe like a debate math type thing. Anyway, so and for you, Geoff, when did math first become controversial to you?
I would say when I started spending time in my daughter's, I guess it was third grade classroom. My background is as a high school teacher and middle school, so I have all the secondary experience. But when I actually started spending time in elementary classrooms, both for my daughters and then others in schools that I support, I really got a window into just how complex thinking is at younger grade levels. And in particular, when it comes to number talks, when I got to experience two students solving an arithmetic problem using two different strategies and conceptualizing numbers and breaking down numbers, and both strategies would have merit. That's the first time I really experienced the joy and the fun of controversy in math class.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. We have 4 guests from 4 different time zones here recording early in this morning. But with that, let's get into the debate. We begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. You each have 2 minutes to present your arguments. And based on a coin flip before this recording, we are starting with the pro side, the side in favor of stop making students memorize. And up first, we have Mandi Tolen, and your time begins now.
The focus of memorization of math facts and algorithms can negatively impact the student's view of their ability, and it can make them believe that they understand math when they really are just good at using a recipe for math. I know that when you think of memorization, you think back to those timed tables in elementary school. I think that is the one vision that everybody gets when we say, let's memorize in the math classroom. And I have talked to a lot of students who did not have success during that memorization time. And because of that, they feel like they were not good at math when they were actually just not good at memorizing. I also have a lot of students who come to me in high school who feel like they are really good at math because they were really good at memorizing. But when I challenge them on their conceptual understanding, when I challenge them on how things work, they're not so good at explaining that because all they've had to do is memorize those recipes and follow those recipes while they've been in school. So I found a really good quote from a study, and it says surface learning is marked by memorization, rote learning, and unquestioning acceptance of information. But deep conceptual learning, however, join concepts, apply them to real life situations, or question conclusions. And that's what we need to do. We need to stop focusing on the memorization of those facts, the memorization of those algorithms, and we need to get students to the point where they are understanding conceptually, where they are seeing how things fit together instead of just memorizing a recipe and trying to follow that.
Perfect. Thank you, Mandi.
And arguing against, we're going to start with Liesl. You're up first on your side. Your time begins now.
Hi. Our claim is that memorization is actually essential as that initial step to get to deep mathematical thinking and long-term success in mathematics. I have two warrants for this claim. First, having mathematical concepts memorized reduces the amount of cognitive load placed on working memory while engaging in mathematics. If we want students to analyze and think deeply about maths, they shouldn't be using their limited working memory space to construct every math fact, theorem, formula every single time. This creates cognitive exhaustion and overload that will ultimately limit their learning potential. The more math students have memorized, the more they have to draw upon and engage in deep mathematical thinking and discussions. They're simply retrieving information from long-term memory instead of having to reconstruct it every single time. My second claim is that relates to the inequities in math that are amplified when we ignore the benefits of memorization. The students being shoved to the margins in math are often exposed to environmental or neurological factors that reduce working memory capacity. Factors such as the chronic stressors, such as poverty, racism, trauma, math anxiety, or multi-language learners. All of these factors are far more likely to have a negative impact on working memory capacity. So avoiding memorization places more demand on working memory, furthering the inequities and struggles of marginalized students. So when we stand on our pedestal of privilege and say students shouldn't memorize, we're making math harder for those who are already marginalized. A discussion around how to support memorization with deep conceptual understanding is a worthy conversation to have, but an equitable and rich mathematical experience for all students must include memorization.
Perfect, right at the buzzer. 2 minutes. Thank you, Liesl. Going back to the pro side, we'll now hear from Mandi's partner, Raj Shah. Raj, you have 2 minutes and your time begins now.
I would say the reality today is most kids are desperately trying to survive math exclusively by memorizing. Memorize addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, standard algorithms, rules for subtraction, arithmetic. When do I need a common denominator? When do I invert and multiply? Multiply across? What are these rules? And then there's rules for decimals. Line them up, remove them, put them back, move both decimals. When you multiply by 10, just add a 0. So many rules that memorize that get you around actual conceptual understanding. It seems to never end. And unfortunately, we have created a system, a school system, that rewards, enables, and reinforces memorization over thinking. Mile-wide curriculum, overemphasis on standardized tests. Teachers are pressed for class time, and they need kids to just get right answers. So perversely, it incentivizes teachers to teach kids to mimic procedures rather than teaching them to think. The way we teach math, the way we assign practice, the way we test, it all tells kids, don't think, just memorize. This stuff is hard. You probably wouldn't understand it anyway. Our students have been conditioned as a result to not worry about whether math even makes sense anymore. Just follow the rules that you've been told. No one stops to ask why or what if questions, which are at the heart of mathematics. And I didn't even mention joy. Math should be irresistible. It should be joyful and fun. And we all know the dreaded question as educators, when will I ever use this? Well, if you're just memorizing math, I don't know when you're ever going to use that either. The joy of math comes from puzzling, thinking, struggling, and eventually figuring things out. When you learn this way, you retain the experience much better than if you're just mindlessly flipping through flashcards. If we want to reclaim math class as a place where we teach kids to think, to solve problems, and to be critical thinkers that the world desperately needs, we have to demand understanding first and memorization after. And that means we need to stop making kids memorize math.
Thank you, Raj. And now we're going to hear from the second person on the opposing side, Geoff. Geoff, you have 2 minutes, and your time begins now.
All right, thanks, Rob. I'd like to expand a little bit on our notion of what memorization looks like and what it is and what it isn't. I think when some teachers talk about memorization, they conjure up these images of drill and kill worksheets where students are doing 50 arithmetic calculations. We've already heard some examples of that in some of the opening statements. We might think of students standing at the board repeating rote multiplication problems over and over again. Basically, what we're hearing is we're equating memorization with bad pedagogy. I want to state here and follow up with examples in this conversation that there are ways to encourage and teach memorized facts in ways that are joyful and adhere to quality teaching practices. Through games, manipulatives, technology, conversation, and other strategies, it is possible to help students build automaticity via memorization in a way that affirms their identity as mathematicians rather than kill it. Encouraging memorization can and should be fun. I would also like to state that encouraging memorization does not mean encouraging cruel teaching practices. We know that some students can memorize facts more quickly than others. If a student needs a formula chart for a time, that's totally okay. I allowed students a cheat sheet during tests and quizzes, and I'd recommend that others do too. Given these aids, it's then upon the teacher to seek out ways to eventually get kids to abandon those cheat sheets and formula charts so we can get to some more complex, in-depth thinking. Because once they do that, they'll be able to free more and they'll be able to be more free in their mathematical experience and solve complex problems more adeptly.
Perfect, right at the time. And that is it. Thank you all. You've given us a lot to think about already. I think both sides, you've spoken about wanting math to be a joyful, like thoughtful place where students are like making sense of things in different ways. But just there's some narrow disagreements on just like where and how we memorize and what that all means. And so with that, let's get into the question round. And Rob, I'll send you the first question.
So this question is actually going to be for Liesl and Geoff. And do we put too much emphasis on memorizing like multiplication facts? And Liesl, I'll kick it to you first.
Do we put too much emphasis on it?
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough question to answer. I think that students should have their basic multiplication facts memorized. But what our side is standing on is that the way that gets memorized should be done in a joyful, playful way built on conceptual understanding. But when students don't have multiplication facts memorized, once they get past those early elementary school ages, then when they're using and manipulating those facts within maybe like a linear systems equation or something, then they're using up too much brain space and too much cognitive space in their brain to be able to figure out a simple multiplication fact when they're in trying to think deeply about something else. And so it just complicates the process for them. And when you look at the research as to when the math gap actually begins, it's pretty consistent up until 4th grade, but the achievement gap in math happens between 4th grade and 8th grade. That's when it goes boom, and then it levels out after 8th grade. Well, what happens after 4th grade? We start using and doing deeper thinking and processes with our basic math facts. So when students don't get those stored in long-term memory up through 4th grade, then they are going to struggle more in those 4th through 8th grade years. And then things just seem to plateau once they get into the high school years.
Possibly. So think about,
reasons.
Go ahead, Geoff. Go ahead.
So think about a number talk. A number talk is a really high level discourse routine in math class. And we all try to achieve some sort of number talk discourse. If you have a number talk on, say, the arithmetic problem 18 times 5, students, in order to engage with that, need some level of arithmetic. Otherwise, the conversation will get bogged down. Students will not be able to break apart, 10 and 8 and multiply those together. They won't be able to engage in those other strategies that their peers are sharing. So how much memorization is a great question, but the fact is students are going to need some sort of arithmetic and times table understanding to engage in that problem. And I mentioned earlier about gamifying math. So I employed a game from Building Fact Fluency from Stenhouse by Tracy Zager and Graham Fletcher. And the game involves rolling dice and multiplying and putting pieces on a game board to try to get 4 in a row. And I employed that game and saw a lot of joy and fun with that game from my students. And at the end of the class, I asked, how many multiplication problems did you do today by playing this game a few times? They suggested an estimated maybe 100, 120 iterations of multiplication. And it was in a way that was fun and didn't feel like standing at the board, didn't feel like drill and kill, but afterwards they realized they had practiced their times tables 100 or more times by playing this game. And that's the kind of memorization we want to encourage, especially when it comes to times tables.
A quick follow-up. When we talk about basic multiplication facts, could you elaborate a little bit more, either Liesl or Geoff, on what is considered basic multiplication facts? Is it all the way to 12, like your 12s tables, like it used to be for years, or do you have some variation of that?
Geoff?
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, at least up to 10, because anything over 10 you can decompose down to 10. So 11s and 12s are kind of a bonus, in my opinion.
All right. And now for the other side, for Mandi and Raj, if we did memorize something in math class, what would it be?
Andy, you want to take it? You want me to give it a whirl?
You can go ahead and start.
If we had to memorize, okay, let's be clear. We're not suggesting that you should never memorize everything. But I think what we are suggesting is that by and large, there's an overemphasis on memorization in mathematics, and that memorization can become, and often does become, a shortcut around conceptual understanding. And that happens sometimes top down, teachers teach in this fashion, or sometimes bottom up, where kids just learn that they can survive math in this way. So should you memorize? Absolutely. Addition, subtraction, multiplication. But even if you just take it multiplication table, there, technically, I guess 100 things in the multiplication chart if we're just doing 1 through 10, right? But if you have some conceptual understanding of the different properties, you can cut that in half. And then you can say, if I know my 2s, I know my 4s. And if I know my 4s, I can double to make 8s. And using those other skills, you can limit the number of things to memorize. And the value in doing it and thinking through things this way, and it probably wouldn't, I don't think the other side would probably argue with this, is that when you forget, you then have a fallback. I meet so many kids who, naturally forgot. I don't remember what 6 times 7 is. Yeah, that happens to me. I'm 51. I sometimes forget what 7 times 8 is. That's normal. But then what can you do with that? If your fallback is, I don't know. I forgot that fact. I'm doomed. Or, oh, I forgot 6 times 7, but I know 3 times 7 is 21, 6 times 7 is 42, or something. Those are skills that we need to help kids develop those kinds of thinking skills. And I don't know a better place to teach people how to think than in math class.
Can I comment on that?
Please go ahead.
Yeah.
So I agree, Raj, that we definitely want students to be able with conceptual understanding and to be able to decompose when forgetting happens. But I just want to point out that decomposing, so I forget what 6 times 7 is, but I can decompose that, and that's 3 times this double of 3 times 7. That process requires the most strain on working memory, which is it creates the most just puts the most pressure on that, because there's so much going on, more so than counting on, because there's so many pieces that are being asked to hold on to working memory, and working memory can only hold 1 to 4 things on a great day. So a student who is experiencing no trauma, no microaggressions, no abuse at home, no chronic stressors, they get 4 things. And when you take 6 times 7, and I forgot it, and I'm like, okay, well, hold on a second. So I'm going to decompose that. And okay, well, 3 times 7, but that is banking on them having 3 times 7 memorized. And so then it's like, okay, so I can pull that, but then I'm doubling that because I'm remembering that 6 is 3 doubled, which is another thing that's been memorized. And, otherwise you're really having to, okay, well, wait, hold on, what's half of 6? Okay. Then they're having to break these things apart. So I really think decomposition is an essential skill to learn, but I see it as a middle step in the process towards long-term potentiation and automaticity. But having that as a middle step will help in those moments when forgetting happens, to be able to fall back, to decompose, to get to that, and to clarify any misconceptions.
Mandi, did you want to add anything to the last question?
That's okay. We actually had the conversation, Raj and I, the other day about what happens when a student doesn't have that memorization in place. Because I'm going to take my son, for instance. We spent 2 years on flashcards and games and other things to learn his multiplication tables, and he struggled. He is a very good conceptual understanding type of person. Like, he really asks deep questions, but his ability to memorize is very, very limited. And he went through most of his elementary classes and even into middle school thinking that he was bad at math because he was bad at memorizing. And so, yes, I think, like Raj said this, there is some memorizing that will help. Multiplication facts are one of them. But there are also ways, and I understand what you're talking about with the cognitive load, but there are ways that we can still allow students to engage with that math if they don't have that memorization. And I just don't want the memorization to be the hang up for students, to say, I can't memorize this and I have a hard time remembering this, so I'm bad at math. I'm not going to be able to engage with the math because I can't remember. And that's the point that I'm coming from. Yes, we all agree that having those multiplication facts stored and to be able to retrieve them quickly will make the math go faster. But does that necessarily mean that they're better at doing math?
And I'm seeing some agreement on both sides about there's some things in multiplication facts that we definitely want kids to have stored pretty strongly in their memory. And we could have a whole episode about debating the best way to do that, or what's the most fun way to do that. But I want to take this down the road then. Let's go all the way to like high school level now. So, and I'll start with Mandi or Raj. If students aren't memorizing along the way, like they never memorize the quadratic formula, maybe they didn't memorize some of their multiplication facts, can students still achieve mastery or deep understanding without any memorization along the way, or with very, very little?
Raj, you want me to take this one?
Sure, fire away.
Okay, so I have had students on both sides of that. So as far as formulas go, I don't think students ever need to memorize formulas because we should always have that available to us to look up. In my opinion, formulas are one of those things that do not need to cloud what's going on in our brain, because if you have it in front of you, as long as you use it and you understand what's happening behind it, that's what you need. You need that understanding of the formula, but you don't necessarily need to have that formula stored. I do have students who come to me in high school who do not have their multiplication facts learned. It just happens. And I can still do things with them like factoring, which is very reliant upon multiplication facts. We just have to use other strategies. One of the strategies that I use with them is, let's take that number and we will use our calculator. Can we start dividing out different factors of that number and just make a list of them? So yes, there are ways that you can still engage with math. I think even sometimes a deeper engagement of math if we're not worried about the memorization of those formulas.
And maybe to the other side then, with that, like the pro side brought up that thinking is not the same as memorization, and I think there's some agreement on this as well. But what memorization do we need to do, or why should we, in terms of thinking about high school students and the high school curriculum?
Sure. I'll reiterate from my opening statement that like formula charts in my classroom are and will always be available to students who need them. However, as we aspire to get students into complex problem solving, as Liesl suggested, is that the ability of a student to engage in a complex task is going to be correlated in some respect to their ability to retrieve mathematical facts, whether it's a formula, whether it's multiplication. So again, that's fine if a student needs to look up the formula for the area of a rectangle. However, that if that student needs to continually look up the area formula for a rectangle, that's naturally going to impede that student's ability to engage in other more complex mathematics. And again, we don't want to like say, well, in that case, you need to go up to the board and write the area equals the base times the height 100 times. That's cruel and that's bad pedagogy. And I want to once again separate this idea of pedagogy from memorization. That these are two separate issues. They're two separate things, or they can be. And it, you know, to Mandi's point, like that is a shame and really unfortunate pedagogy that a student might think they are bad at math because they don't memorize information quickly. And I just want to honor that and leave space for that. And my heart breaks for students who feel that way. And to that is again a lesson of pedagogy that teacher or this system needs to sort of reimagine and not necessarily make it equating a quick memorization with their ability to do math.
So that takes me into thinking about technology, and this is going to be for Liesl and Geoff. When we are thinking about technology and calculators and computers, in the real world, they now have technology at their beck and call for the most part. You know, they can ask Amazon, they could ask, Amazon Alexa, they could ask Google, they could ask Siri, they could, there are a lot of options out there. So the question, I guess, is are we ignoring their reality by making them memorize different elements of mathematics? And Liesl, you can take it first.
Sure. I think it depends on what is being asked to be memorized. So like area formulas, that's like, what's the surface area of a cone? I don't know, right? Like that's something that is not highly relevant in the long-term context of mathematical exploration. And so, yeah, ask Siri, ask the not your calculator, but look it up on Google. But when a student is, just think about how much effort that takes to look it up on Google, flip through your textbook, ask Siri, whatever, to find it. It's going to happen like that. compare that to a student who's trying to factor a trinomial with a constant term of 72. And now they're trying to find all of the factors of 72 to be able to factor this trinomial. That's not something, I mean, sure, you can ask Siri to give you all the factors of 72, but that's not going to be able to help you find the right pairs, especially if you have a lead coefficient that's different than 1, to be able to factor this. And so that's going to take so much more cognitive work on behalf of the student. So the conversation around technology, you see how there's a difference here of how much effort is still being placed on a student, even when there's things that could be easily, a calculator or some other form of technology could be used for. So my perspective is that we want to make math accessible to everyone. And when we make it more difficult for some students because it's requiring more stamina than they have the ability for, and not just because, and it's not because of them. It is because of systemic issues, and it's also because just look at the natural capacity of the brain. Like, it's not designed to be able to hang on to all this information at once. And so that's we're just trying to limit those barriers to make math accessible for all.
Geoff, do you have anything on that side?
No, Liesl crushed it, for the record. So I don't think I need to add anything.
Okay, thanks, Geoff. But now on the other side, for Mandi and Raj, then the question that I have for you would be, will students rely too much on technology and calculators if we don't have them memorized? And I work with a lot of teachers that do a lot of professional developments like all of you. And I hear oftentimes like algebra teachers saying these kids don't understand their facts, they don't know their facts, so they can't do this, which that's a whole other conversation for a different day. But the question again is, will students rely too much on technology and calculators if we don't have them memorize things?
So I want to comment a couple things here. So Liesl, I appreciate what you said there. And I think your point about the students who are under stress in life and all these other, and how that affects brain development, I think that's super important. I'm glad that you're raising that here, because I think that is something that we maybe don't always think about as much as we should. And it's super important that your brain just it develops differently and makes it much more difficult. So I appreciate that. On the other hand, you mentioned factoring and trinomial, and I knew you just threw this out there with a 72 in it, but like, to me, that's sort of the perfect example of what's wrong with mathematics. Nobody needs to factor a trinomial with something that has a 72 in it. And I know you were just using that as an example, but again, so many of the things we're asking kids to do in math class are irrelevant to anything. So can you factor a polynomial with the 72 in it? You can, or trinomial, but like, why would you? Yes, use technology. Oh my goodness. We can teach this with smaller numbers so you'll understand the concept and why we would do it and what it's useful for and how you get the roots and all this other stuff. But then by all means, use technology after that. Long division, we're teaching, how much time do we spend teaching kids long division? No adult I know does long division on pencil and paper, and neither should they. If you have a 2-digit divisor, grab a calculator, ask Siri, don't even bother. So a lot of this is what we've done to math to sort of destroy it. And I think part of our argument here about stop memorizing math is that the way the system is and the stress, the way that we've constructed it with all this unnecessary stuff that kids have to learn to pass the test incentivizes both the teacher and the student to teach by memorization. And I think we all agree that none of us want that, right? So to that extent, we're in agreement. Okay, end of ramble.
And Mandi, do you want to add to that?
Well, to quote Geoff, Raj crushed it. So.
Very good. Awesome. So we have two amazing teams here crushing it. Just a few more questions here. I want to think a little bit more about the student experience. And I know you talked about like the math anxiety, Mandi and Raj, that students feel from feeling they're not good enough because they didn't memorize stuff. But then also Liesl and Geoff, you brought up kind of this idea of like equity and privilege. And so I don't know what my question is in all of this, but I'll start with Mandi and Raj. Like, are we being privileged in having this conversation or in having students not memorize? Are we not doing what's best for the students?
I actually kind of view the memorization also as from the other side of privilege. So just thinking back to my comment about my son, where I spent time working with him with flashcards and games, a lot of students don't have that. And if we are relying on that memorization to get them past fourth grade math, then what happens to the students who do not have the supports or have the trauma and they don't have the ability or the mental capacity at that time to do that memorization? And so I kind of view that memorization, like the requirement of that, almost as a hindrance as well, especially for students who don't have the support.
And then maybe to the other side, what about those students who feel like they're not good at math because they've been asked to memorize and they just can't for whatever reason or whatever stress?
Yeah, I'll take that. So yeah, so as I mentioned, it's essential that the teacher highlights ways that students can be smart in math in multiple ways. And if the only way that a student feels that they can be smart is by reciting off, math facts very quickly, then that's sort of bad teaching. We need to find ways to highlight multiple ways that students can be smart in math. And I fully concur with Raj that to me the real essence of mathematics is around problem solving. And when students are continually looking up arithmetic facts or formulas, that's just going to get in the way of problem solving. So I fully concur that we need to sort of revision and rethink our curriculum. And as far as standardized tests go, as a PhD student, my dissertation is going to be around assessment of students in ways that are equitable and not based on standardized tests. So there's absolutely no disagreement there. So I'll just end of ramble, as Raj said.
I think, I mean, Geoff, I want to make sure that we're all catching the point that Geoff continues to drive home here. And that is the separation between good pedagogy and the need for students to have a strong sense of some basic math facts. You know, Mandi, you used the quote early on about memorization is about surface learning. And surface learning is essential for deeper learning to happen. You can't do deeper learning unless you have surface learning to work with. There is no substance, there's no ingredients to cook with to do the deep exploration without the surface learning. And it's a very complex topic that you're diving into here, Chris. And I love that you brought it up because there are so many factors that are, both systemic and pedagogy based that influence the inequities in math education. And it's all so big. It's so big and it's so heavy, and we see it every day in our classrooms. But I get concerned when we look for an easy way out to just do like a Band-Aid approach and not help those students who are being marginalized to build that efficacy, to build their math identity by really diving into effective pedagogy in mathematics based on how the brain actually learns. Because I do believe that all students can learn math at a high level. They can also learn their basic math facts at with conceptual understanding. It is possible through good pedagogy. So before we just say to heck with memorization, give them the calculator, I would rather we step back and really analyze our pedagogy and find ways to improve that, to confront the narratives that we have been taught and have been passed down from generation to generation, and find ways to make deep conceptual understanding accessible for all math students.
Wow, thank you, Liesl. So this is going to be the last question for both sides, okay? And this is, I want you to speak directly to the teachers that are listening, if I am a teacher that is coming to you, I'm going to start with Mandi and Raj, and I say, okay, how does this change the way that teachers teach and how I should teach based on your side? How pedagogy, like how is this going to change the way that I should teach?
It depends on how you teach now. But I guess if I give this a whirl here, I would say, because again, I'm gonna go back to my main point. The whole system, I think, is structured or incentivizes memorization over understanding. So the primary goal of everything, I think, should start with understanding. Do you need to memorize certain things? Absolutely. Nobody's saying you shouldn't. I know we have a provocative title, Stop Memorizing Math. But of course you have to memorize. And Liesl's 100% correct. I mean, that's how the brain works. You have to have facts in there to be able to recall them and then use them to do higher level thinking. We're not arguing against that. But when we think about potentially changing what you're doing, it's making sure that there's understanding of those things and that we're not using memorization as a way to sidestep or shortcut understanding. And it's so easy, again, for us to do as educators and for students to interpret that as what their role is because of the way the system is. My son is taking AP Calculus BC right now as a junior, his choice, not mine. This class is moving at warp speed. There is no way, and I feel for the teacher, there is no way that this teacher can teach for conceptual understanding when in the middle of the year, they've already done all of differentiation, all of integration. Now they're doing integration with U substitution, all this other stuff. He's just hanging on for dear life, memorizing it all, right? This is what I'm talking about. Like, and this is not the teacher's fault. No teacher can teach for conceptual understanding at this speed. So wherever we can as educators, pushing back, slowing down, taking time to make sure our kids are understanding, and also not using them not knowing or not having memorized certain things as a gatekeeper. My students could never do this. They don't know how to multiply yet. I see that a lot. And it's like, no, if I structure this correctly is not the right word. If I can structure this problem in a way where it's accessible to anyone, even if they don't know all their facts yet. Maybe they can draw a picture to get started. Maybe they can do something else to get going on this problem. And that thinking may have value to the rest of the class who may have things memorized and skipped over something really important because of, they already memorized it. So yeah. End of ramble again.
I'm going to add to what Raj said, and really I'm just probably reiterating what Raj said. If we're talking to teachers and talking about how we can change how we approach math, if we want to look at our pedagogy and what we're doing, we need to stop focusing on the assessment of a formula. We need to start asking students why things are happening, how do they know things are happening? Because a lot of times when we give assessments of students, whether it's a standardized assessment, whether it's a classroom assessment, we are assessing their ability to memorize the information. Can you regurgitate the process that I've given you? And we've done it so many times that you've hopefully stored it. And that's the one thing that we need to change. We need to start focusing more on, why is this happening? How do you know this is happening? What are your thoughts behind it? How does this make you feel? And not just, can you recall the information that we've talked about? Because recall doesn't necessarily mean understanding.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you. And to the other side with Liesl and Geoff, again, speaking directly to the teachers listening. So does this mean that what we imagine a traditional teacher doing should continue? Or how could we incorporate what you're arguing more into the class, and what would that look like? And Geoff, you could start, or Liesl, it doesn't matter.
Okay. So again, I would return to the question of not, is memorization important? I would seek out ways, how do we encourage memorization in ways that do build up students' mathematical identity. And there are multitudes of ways of doing that. And I would encourage teachers to seek out some of these strategies. So for example, I mentioned some gamification earlier. So there's great games that are fun that whether students know it or not are practicing memorization. Another example is there's a great game, board game called Prime Climb. Maybe some of y'all have played it. And essentially that game is a fun game that my students and my own children played a lot. And whether they knew it or not, they were practicing factoring by playing Prime Climb. These are the kinds of experience that bring joy into the math classroom, that encourage memorization, not forcing, not like force feeding memorization, but encourage memorization in ways that are fun, low stakes, and low stress. Other examples might be things like card sorts, where students use manipulatives and put concepts together across the table. Manipulatives, games, technology, discourse number talks is a great way of practicing arithmetic like dozens of times within one mathematical task in a way that still brings in creativity and joy and fun. And though that's the real question that teachers need to be seeking out, is what are those experiences that encourage memorization in a way that is joyful.
And for me, what I would say to teachers is thank you for what you're doing. We appreciate you. It's hard work. I'd say step back and look at your content, look at your curriculum, look at your scope and sequence, and be willing to push against the system to identify what are the essentials and to really narrow in and focus on that, especially right now in the time that we're in with, it used to be that, there was a subset of our student population who are experiencing chronic stressors. Now we all are, as we are finishing up a second year of a global pandemic, and it's impacting all of us in different ways. And so the more that we understand our students, the more we can create a safe and joyful place for math exploration, the quicker we'll be able to move through our content, but it'll give you more space and more time to have the conceptual understanding and to give yourself some grace, because there are systemic and structural issues that are working against you. Everything from, curriculums to class sizes and so many other things that make this ideal that we're, conveniently, we can sit here, on a Saturday morning and conveniently talk about, yeah, everyone should have some basic things stored in their long-term memory and they can retrieve it in deep mathematical exploration. But the reality is it's complex. What we're talking about is really complex. To get an entire class of 30, 35 students to have deep conceptual understanding of a concept when everyone brings their own unique experiences to it. So focus in on the things that you can, find ways to slow things down and find what's most relevant to your students and help them build that conceptual understanding that will lead to automaticity, because that will set them up for greater success in their mathematical journey.
Thank you, Liesl. And that concludes our questioning round. We will now end by giving each side 2 minutes to make their final arguments to you.
And we are going to begin with Raj Shah. Raj, go ahead.
All right. So I think Mandi and I would say the following. Number one, when we talk about memorization here, we are talking about sort of blind memorization, the repetitive effort to commit facts to memory in isolation of all the other facts. And our concern is that too much of math feels this way to students, where they're committing isolated facts, trying to commit isolated facts to memory with no connection. So I think we can all agree here that understanding somehow has to come first. And one way to do that is to make sure that we are asking those questions and assessing for, why does this work this way? How does it work this way? What if we tried it that way? Does this always work? Why am I carrying the one? These are questions students should be encouraged to ask, and then we should be talking about as we go through the learning of mathematics. And then at the end, if things need to be memorized, absolutely, we can spend time memorizing them. And I love the ideas about making it fun and putting it in a context where there's some motivation, some intrinsic motivation to do that. So I think a lot of these things we have in common. It's just that blind memorization that we have to really worry about when we're trying to teach kids math effectively and get them to become problem solvers. Because yeah, in reality, they have technology. They can answer most of these arithmetic questions and things with technology. Math is supposed to be joyful, and it's supposed to be about thinking. And that's where we want kids to experience first before they blindly sort of memorize things.
Okay. And then with the final word, we have the opposing side and Liesl McConchie. Your 2 minutes begins now.
Great. So the cognitive benefits of memorization are many. It paves the way for higher order thinking and creates space for creativity and novel thinking in mathematics. So additionally, facilitating memorization is a tool to help learning be more equitable in math. And so sure, we can ask students to construct something on their own each time, but they who are able to do that are the ones who have the resources, who are privileged enough to not be exposed to environmental and systemic factors that limit cognition. So the real debate isn't should students memorize? That's an emphatic yes. The debate is how do we help students memorize and what should they memorize? How do we best support the transfer of mathematical knowledge to long-term memory so that all students can engage in the beauty of mathematical exploration and problem solving instead of mimicry and robotics? How do we encourage memorization in ways that are joyful and enhance a student's mathematical identity? And we've offered many strategies that focus on the mathematical pedagogy that is happening in classrooms, such as gamifying arithmetic, employing counting strategies at younger grades, and having students demonstrate math in small groups in the older ages. Memorization should be facilitated through conceptual understanding, hands down, through play, with multi-sensory instruction, through chunking the content into smaller pieces. It should happen over time with spaced learning and retrieval practices. All of these are elements of effective math pedagogy. Memorization doesn't have to be a chore. It doesn't have to conjure up visions of endless hours of drill and kill. When information has been memorized, in other words, transferred to long-term memory successfully, it reduces the strain on other regions of the brain needed for deep conceptual exploration in math. This allows a learner to use the full breadth of their mathematical genius to explore, manipulate, play, and discover the beauties of mathematics.
Wow, thank you all. And that concludes our debate. You've given us so much to think about, and we can't continue to dive into what both sides have to say and probably re-listen to this episode a few times.
But now it's up to our listeners to take a moment to ponder the arguments and consider what resonated with you, what arguments really swayed you. All right, go to our Twitter at DebateMathPod to vote for who you think was more convincing in this debate.
We will leave it up for 1 week and tally the results by the end of the week.
And huge thanks to all 4 of our guests. Thank you for a thoughtful, respectful debate. We had such good civil discourse happening here, great ideas, and I think both sides found places of agreement as well as disagreement. I don't know about you all, but I learned so much just by listening to all their thoughts and ideas.
And also thanks to those who are listening. We hope you enjoyed and learned from this and explored some of the nuance with memorization. Don't forget to go to our Twitter page and vote.
And as we wrap up, Mandi Tolen, where can listeners find you?
You can follow me on Twitter at Mandi Tolen EDU. I also have 2 different blogs, makemathnotsuck.com, where I share a lot of my math ideas, and then infinitelyteaching.com, where I share technology ideas for the classroom.
Wonderful. And Raj Shah, where can we find you?
On Twitter at Dr. Raj Shah, and on the web, drrajshah.com, and maybe on Grassroots workshops, where I have a course on what we can learn as math educators from video game designers.
And Liesl, where can we find you?
Same places. You can find me on Twitter, Liesl McConchie, and my website is lieslmcconchie.com. And I also have a workshop on Grassroots Workshop that dives into the science of motivation and what actually motivates the brain to learn.
And Geoff, where can listeners find you?
Twitter, just my name, @Geoff Krall. I also have a website, emergentmath.com. And then from Stenhouse, you can check out Necessary Conditions, which is a book that I had the privilege of writing a couple years ago. So any of those places.
Wonderful. Thank you all. That concludes this episode.